There's a number I need you to hold in your head before I say anything else. 1 billion. Not a metaphor. Not an analyst's projection. 1 billion barrels of oil. Gone. Vanished from the world's available supply. Not because the wells ran dry. Not because the reservoirs emptied. Because one country decided it owned a 21-mile stretch of water it does not legally own, put armed boats in it, and told the captains of the world's tankers that they had a simple choice. Pay up or turn around. That is what happened to the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026. And the world, the most powerful economies on Earth, the navies that dominate every ocean, the governments that write the international laws governing freedom of navigation, quietly paid it. For weeks, one country held 1 billion barrels of the world's oil supply hostage, and the world paid the ransom, until one country didn't. Until one country did something so cold, so calculated, so structurally devastating that it didn't need a single missile to fire back. It signed a piece of paper, drew a line on a map through its own desert, and in doing so began the slow demolition of everything Iran thought it had built. This is not a story about a war. This is a story about something far more dangerous than a war. This is a story about who controls the price of everything. And it starts not with a missile. It starts with a tanker captain, 3,000 miles from his family, doing the math on whether a bonus is worth a funeral. Let me give you the geography first, because if you don't feel the geography in your body, none of what follows will land the way it should. Pull up a map of the Persian Gulf. Look at the mouth of it, where the Gulf narrows into a bottleneck before opening into the Gulf of Oman and then the wider Indian Ocean. That bottleneck is the Strait of Hormuz. It is 21 miles wide at its tightest point. 21 miles. You could drive it in under 20 minutes on a highway. And yet through those 21 miles every single day flows approximately 27% of the world's entire maritime trade in crude oil and petroleum products. Not 27% of one region's oil. 27% of the planet's Saudi crude, Iraqi crude, Kuwaiti crude, Qatari liquefied natural gas, Emirati barrels. Every barrel from every field in every Gulf state threads that same needle, loads onto the same tankers, passes through the same 21 miles of water before it can reach the refineries and power plants and gas stations of Europe, Asia, and the rest of the connected world. On the northern shore of that 21-mile needle sits Iran. And on February 28, 2026, after the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iranian targets, Iran made a decision. It decided that if it could not win the war being fought in the air and on land, it would fight a different war entirely. Not the war you draw on a whiteboard with troop movements and satellite imagery of burning armor. A different kind of war. The kind fought in insurance premiums. The kind fought in the nervous calculations of freight desks in Singapore and Rotterdam and Houston. The kind fought in the hesitation of a tanker captain who looks at the route his company wants him to take and asks himself a question that no bonus structure can fully answer. Is this worth it? On March 4th, 6 days after the first strikes, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Not with a formal legal proclamation, not with a naval blockade in the old gunboat sense, with something far more effective than either of those, with mines, with drones, with fast attack boats that appeared without warning, with missiles, and with the memory, burned into every maritime insurance database on Earth, of the 5 crew members who died in the early attacks on vessels that tried to cross without permission. Iran did not need to sink 50 tankers to shut a waterway. It needed to sink 2. And then let every other captain do the math himself. This is the thing most people fundamentally misunderstand about what Iran was doing. They imagine a fleet-on-fleet engagement. They imagine the kind of confrontation where the United States, which operates the most powerful naval force in human history, simply shows up and the other side melts. Iran knew that too. Better than anyone, Iran has watched American carrier groups operate in the Persian Gulf for decades. It has no illusions about what a direct military confrontation with the U.S. Navy would produce. So Iran did not fight that war. It fought the war it could actually win. The war fought not against steel hulls and combat aircraft, but against the one thing the modern global economy cannot function without. Certainty. The calm, boring, completely taken for granted assumption that ships go where they are supposed to go. Take that assumption away, and you do not need to fire a single additional shot. The entire architecture of global trade begins to seize up on its own. Tanker traffic through the strait collapsed. Not partially, not manageably, collapsed. Traffic fell to roughly 10% of pre-war normal levels. 9 out of every 10 ships that used to make that crossing, gone. Hundreds of tankers idling on both sides of the water, full of crude, engines running, crews waiting, going nowhere. And the ones that did cross, they crossed Iran's way. Here is where the story stops being about geopolitics and starts being about something that should make every person on Earth deeply uncomfortable. Because what Iran built inside that 21-mile stretch of water was not a military operation in any traditional sense. It was a business. Let me describe exactly how it worked because the details matter. A tanker operator reaches out through intermediaries connected to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the organization formally designated as a terrorist entity by the United States government. There is a negotiation. Fees were reported at up to $2 million per voyage, structured around roughly $1 per barrel of cargo. Payment in cash, in cryptocurrency, or through barter arrangements, not in US dollars, in Chinese yuan, in stablecoins. Once payment was confirmed, the operator received a permit code. The ship would broadcast that code over radio as it approached the transit zone. An IRGC patrol boat would come out to meet it. The escort would guide the vessel through the strait, hugging the Iranian coastline, threading between the islands Iran controls. In some cases, operators were instructed to change their vessel's flag registration for the duration of the transit. Between March 1st and March 15th alone, approximately 89 to 90 vessels moved through the strait under some form of this clearance arrangement. Read that back slowly. A unit of a government's armed forces, specifically a unit designated as a terrorist organization by the world's largest economy, was operating a toll road on international waters, taking payment in cryptocurrency, issuing passcodes, escorting tankers past its own coastline for a percentage of the cargo value. This was not a military operation. It was a protection racket with a national flag on it. And the most uncomfortable part, the part that almost nobody wanted to say out loud through the spring of 2026, is that the world paid it. Shipping companies paid it. The cargo kept moving at 10% of normal volume at extorted rates through a system that had no legal basis under any framework of international maritime law. They paid because the alternative was your cargo sitting on a tanker that cannot move, your supply contracts broken, your customers screaming, your insurance void the moment your vessel enters a declared war zone without permission of the people who declared it one. And Washington could not simply sanction every operator who paid the toll without shutting off the only functioning trickle of oil still moving through the strait. The protection racket ran. 1 billion barrels gone. 100 million additional barrels disappearing every week. The strait stayed closed. Now let me tell you what happened to oil prices, because this is where the war stopped happening to other people in a region most people cannot find on a map and started happening to you. To your mortgage, to your grocery bill, to the interest rate on your car loan. Earlier in the crisis, Brent crude punched toward $120 a barrel. At the end of May 2026, it closed at $92.56. And that number, which sounds almost calm, is the result of a market whipsawing for months between hope and terror. Every hint of a diplomatic agreement, prices fall. Every new Iranian demand, every fresh threat, every ambiguous object spotted floating in the strait, prices twitch back upward. The market is not trading oil right now. It is trading the mood of a negotiation. And while it trades that mood, it moves everything downstream of it. American inflation was pushed to its highest level in years by this conflict, not by anything happening on American soil, by a 21-mile stretch of water where armed boats were collecting crypto payments from tanker captains. Iran squeezes the strait, freight rates spike, fuel prices climb, airlines pass cost to tickets, trucking companies pass cost to every product they carry, supermarkets pass cost to every item on every shelf, and somewhere in a city that has never heard of the Strait of Hormuz, a family looks at their grocery bill and feels the arithmetic of extortion landing in their kitchen. Resilient is not the same as immune. The economy of 2026 does not break. It bleeds. And Iran understood exactly how to keep the cut open. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels from emergency reserves. 400 million barrels sounds enormous. At world consumption rates of around 105 million barrels per day, it covers roughly 4 days of global demand. Against normal Hormuz flows, approximately 20 days of typical traffic, the release may soften the shock temporarily, but it changes nothing as long as the real problem, the free movement of tankers through Hormuz, stays unresolved. 400 million barrels of emergency stock against 100 million barrels vanishing every single week. The math was never on the world's side. The math was always Iran's most powerful weapon. But here is where the story turns. Here is where it stops being about Iranian leverage and starts being about something Iran never fully calculated. Because while Iran was perfecting its toll booth, while it was issuing passcodes and collecting UN payments and watching the world's supply chain bleed, one country was quietly doing something far more consequential than firing missiles back. One country was not fighting Iran's war. It was building a different future entirely. The United Arab Emirates walked out of OPEC. In a surprise announcement made in the middle of a war, the Gulf's third largest oil producer said it was quitting OPEC and the wider OPEC Plus group to pursue its national interests. 50 years. For 50 years, OPEC has been the mechanism through which a small group of oil-producing nations has disciplined global supply and set the world's energy prices. One of the most durable and consequential economic arrangements in modern history. The cartel that survived the Cold War, the shale revolution, multiple regional conflicts, and a global pandemic just lost a member. Not just any member. A member that had been quietly building the capacity to pump 5 million barrels a day by 2027, free of any quota, free of any collective discipline, free of any permission structure connecting back to Riyadh or Moscow or Tehran. And then the UAE confirmed something that made the OPEC exit look like the opening move in a longer game. It was building a pipeline, not through the Strait of Hormuz around it, so through its own desert all the way to Fujairah, a port sitting on the Gulf of Oman on the outside of the trap. A pipeline to Fujairah is a pipeline that never has to thread Iran's needle at all. The UAE already had one line running there with capacity around 1.8 million barrels per day. Now, it was racing to double that export capacity with a 2027 target. 50% of the new pipeline already built. Work continuing through the war. Sultan Al Jaber, who runs Abu Dhabi National Oil Company and serves as a UAE minister, did not mince a single word. He called Iran's blockade what it was, the arithmetic of extortion, and then he said, the thing that made everyone listening go quiet. He warned that even if a deal was signed tomorrow, it would take minimum 4 months to ramp oil flows back to 80% of normal. Full normalization would not arrive until the first or second quarter of 2027. Even the best case scenario, the one where everyone shakes hands this week, still leaves the world's oil supply half strangled deep into next year. The damage is already done. The only question is how much more accumulates, while the negotiators argue. But it was the line after that which contained the real warning. Al Jaber said that once you accept that a single country can hold the world's most important waterway hostage, freedom of navigation as we know it is finished. And if that principle is not defended now, the next decade will be spent defending against the consequences. That is not an oil executive talking. That is someone standing at an inflection point in how the world works, describing clearly which direction it is about to tip. Because here's what Iran was actually testing underneath all the toll booths and the crypto payments and the passcode escorts. It was not testing whether it could hurt the global economy. It knew it could do that. What it was testing was something far more fundamental. Whether the idea that the sea is open still has teeth. The entire architecture of global trade rests on an assumption so basic that most people never consciously hold it. That ships go where they are supposed to go. That a narrow stretch of water belonging geographically to one country does not belong to that country to ransom. That international waters are international. Iran decided to find out if that was a real principle or a story powerful countries told themselves. And for weeks in the spring of 2026, the answer the world gave back was not encouraging. There was a draft resolution at the United Nations Security Council demanding Iran reopen the strait, co-written by the United States and Bahrain on behalf of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the UAE, backed by nearly 2/3 of the world's countries. 2/3 of the planet on paper against what Iran was doing, and it went nowhere. Russia and China blocked it. Of course they did. China was the buyer Iran specifically wanted those yuan payments from. Russia had every reason to watch Western economies sweat through an energy crisis while its own oil commanded elevated prices on global markets. The two countries with veto power in the chamber, where this had to be resolved, were the two countries with the most to gain from the situation continuing. The choke point was not only in the water, it was in the council chamber too. So the world sat with its resolution going nowhere, its emergency reserves buying days rather than months, its tanker traffic at 10% of normal, and its grocery bills climbing in cities that had never heard of the IRGC. Now let me bring you to the last few days, because this is where it is genuinely live and genuinely unresolved. There is a ceasefire, fragile, more a pause than a peace, in place since April 8th and punctuated by skirmishes throughout. Around it, two sides circling a memorandum of understanding. A first piece of paper that would formalize the pause. Terms being discussed included a 60-day ceasefire extension, reopening of the strait, ending a U.S. blockade of Iranian ports, and launching formal nuclear negotiations. One Thursday in late May, it looked close. Iran and the United States appeared to reach a tentative agreement. And then the following Friday, President Trump made a series of demands on the strait, on Iran's nuclear program, on the unfreezing of Iranian assets that did not land well in Tehran. The deal that had looked nearly finished on Thursday was, by Friday evening, back to being a work in progress. That whipsaw is the cycle the oil price has been riding for months. Every hint of a signature, prices fall. Every hardened position from either side, they climb back. And here's the detail from those final days that captures the full texture of where this actually stands. While the two sides were supposedly at a table working toward an agreement to reopen the waterway, Iran was not standing down its toll operation. It had built an entire new bureaucracy to administer the transit fee system, a formal body dedicated to collecting payments and issuing clearances. The U.S. Treasury sanctioned it. Iran's response was to announce that the authority would continue its operations without interruption. Without interruption. The machine for controlling the water was being told to keep running at the exact moment its operators were supposedly negotiating to hand control back. And on that same day, Omani authorities reported a floating object in the strait believed to be a naval mine. One mine, drifting. That is all it takes. One ambiguous shape in the water and every insurer in London recalculates. Every captain hesitates. The entire fragile trickle of traffic at 10% of normal could seize up again in hours. The threat does not need to be real. It only needs to be possible. The weapon is not the explosion. The weapon is the doubt. So let me put the full board in front of you. On one side, Iran. Militarily outmatched in every conventional dimension, economically squeezed, but holding the one card that lets a smaller power pin a larger one. The ability to make the world's most important waterway feel unsafe. and to charge for the privilege of pretending it isn't. On another side, the Gulf Arab states, desperate not to be drawn into open war, equally desperate not to let Iran become the permanent gatekeeper of their economic existence. Hedging in every direction, pipelines through the desert, exits from the cartel, resolutions at the UN, air defense systems burning through interceptor stocks at rates already forcing emergency resupply. And then Israel, watching the negotiations with a very specific and very cold fear. What Israeli strategic planners see when they look at the proposed deal is not a path to resolution. It is the outline of the outcome they have feared for 20 years. A settlement that leaves Iran's missile arsenals intact, its proxy networks intact, its nuclear infrastructure intact, its demonstrated ability to squeeze a waterway intact, its newfound knowledge that the world will pay a ransom rather than fight the war required to close the toll booth permanently. To Israel, that is not peace. It is a pause. A pause that lets Iran rebuild and return with the knowledge of exactly what it got away with last time. Here's the question I cannot stop turning over. The one underneath all the others that nobody at any negotiating table has cleanly answered. How do you reopen the Strait of Hormuz without rewarding what Iran did to close it? There are only two paths. Both cost you something you cannot easily get back. Path 1. You allow Iran some face-saving version of what it built. An environmental transit fee, a maritime coordination charge, worded carefully enough that it is not called a toll but functions as one. The ships move again. The crude flows. The grocery bills stop climbing quite so fast. And every government controlling a narrow stretch of strategically important water learns the lesson that will define the next 50 years of global trade. This works. The Bab el-Mandeb, the Bosphorus, the Malacca Strait. Every government with a navy and a grievance in 21 miles of water looks at what Iran did and what Iran kept and draws the obvious conclusion. Path 2. You refuse. You insist on free passage with no concession. The talks collapse. The mine stays in the water. The traffic stays at 10% of normal. 1 billion barrels already gone. 100 million more vanishing every week. No end date. Iran constructed this situation specifically to ensure both options hurt. That is what makes it not just a military crisis or an energy crisis, but something more durable and more dangerous. A trap designed to be a trap. And the most unsettling read of what Iran was doing is that it never expected to win the war. It expected to win the aftermath. Which brings me back to the UAE, and to why the move Abu Dhabi made in the middle of this storm will matter more over the next 20 years than anything that happened in the air or on the water. The UAE did not wait for the trap to be sprung and then fight about who owned it. It looked at a future where one country could hold a waterway hostage with regularity whenever it felt cornered, whenever it needed leverage, and it decided not to depend on the goodwill of that arrangement at all. It decided not to trust the negotiation. It decided not to route its economic future through 21 miles of water it did not control. It built around the problem, a pipeline through its own desert. A port on the outside of the trap, production capacity unchained from a cartel whose collective discipline it could no longer afford. When the strait reopens, the UAE will begin ramping toward 5 million barrels per day with no quota ceiling. That volume entering global markets will structurally depress oil prices for years. And for Iran, an economy already under catastrophic strain from war costs, blockade, energy grid failures, food supply collapse, and industrial shutdown that has put 10 to 12 million workers at risk of income loss. A post-war environment of persistently low oil prices, driven by unconstrained UAE production, is not an inconvenience. It is potentially the final condition that makes the Islamic Republic's fiscal architecture unsustainable. Iran fired missiles at the Dubai International Finance Center. Iran struck Jebel Ali port. Iran attacked the Ruwais refinery. And the UAE responded not with missiles, but with a decision that will drain Iran's budget for the next decade. That is what it looks like when a country that understands the long game responds to a country that only thinks in the short one. There is one more thing worth sitting with because it runs underneath all the oil prices and pipeline announcements and Security Council resolutions. Iran demanding payment in Chinese yuan and stablecoins rather than US dollars was not a random detail, not a logistical convenience. It was a small dagger aimed at something that has underpinned American power since the 1,970 seconds. The petrodollar, the global system under which oil is priced and settled in American dollars. That arrangement has given the United States a structural advantage for 50 years. When the world needs oil, the world needs dollars. And the dollar's reserve currency status flows directly from that. Iran demanding yuan and stablecoins for straight transit was not only about sanctions evasion, it was a signal. A test of whether the dollar's grip on global energy could be loosened by anyone bold enough to demand something else. China was watching. Russia was watching. Every country looking for a way to conduct international trade outside the dollar system was watching. And the fact that the world paid, that shipping companies sent yuan to IRGC intermediaries rather than shut down their supply chains, was noted by everyone paying attention. This conflict is not only about oil, it is about who sets the price of oil, and about whether that price gets settled in dollars or in something else entirely. So here's where we actually stand. Brent at $92.56. The market holding its breath. A ceasefire more pause than peace. A memorandum nearly signed Thursday and not signed Friday. An IRGC transit authority told to keep running despite being sanctioned. A floating object in the strait that may or may not be a mine. A UAE pipeline 50% complete and accelerating. A cartel that just lost a member who intends to flood the market the moment it is free to do so. A Saudi Arabia recalculating nuclear deterrence. A Security Council resolution blocked by the two countries with the most to gain from blocking it. A world bleeding 100 million barrels of lost supply every week and being told that even the best case scenario leaves it half strangled until 2027. And underneath all of that, one question that no government, no energy market, and no maritime insurer has cleanly answered yet. Is the world willing to pay a ransom it can technically afford? And is the fact that we can survive Iran's blackmail exactly the reason we will end up living with it? The UAE has already given its answer. It is not waiting for the question to be resolved. It is routing around it, building walls around its own supply, making the choke point matter less rather than fighting forever over who controls it. The price on the screen says $92 and calm. Watch the water instead, because calm is not the same as resolved, and the mine does not need to be real. It only needs to be possible. 1 billion barrels gone, 100 million more every week. The machine that collected the toll has been told to keep running. That is what Iran held hostage. And that is what the UAE just spent a pipeline and an OPEC exit trying to make sure can never be held hostage again.